Hello, everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Kamini, and I'm your host. My guest today is Dr. Ntokozo Mahlangu. Ntokozo is Head of Operational Risk for Corporate and Investment Banking at Investec. He has extensive experience spanning operational risk, wealth, and investment operations and banking across South Africa and the UK. Beyond his technical expertise, Ntokozo writes on governance, ethics, and societal impact, exploring how South Africa can integrate Ubuntu, our uniquely South African philosophy of interconnectedness, dignity, and human responsibility, into corporate governance. He also serves on the Strategic Advisory Board of the DaVinci Institute. The reason that I wanted to speak to Ntokozo today is when I read his recent article, Reclaiming South Africa's Moral Leadership, reflecting on King 5 and the boardroom's role in shaping the future. I knew that I had to get him on the show and take a deep dive on the topic. Ntokozo joins us today in his personal capacity to discuss how Ubuntu and King 5 can guide ethical AI governance and responsible leadership in South Africa. Welcome, Ntokozo.
Thank you, Kamini. Appreciate you inviting me onto your platform, and let's see what we can co-create around the subject.
Fantastic. Ntokozo, your article frames King 5 as a pivotal moment for South African governance. You talk about trust and governance fatigue, repeated corporate and public scandals, and position this as an opportunity to reclaim moral leadership. Can you tell me more about that? What is the crisis we're facing, and why is King 5 different from previous iterations? What makes this moment for moral leadership?
Thanks, Kamini. I think this is a very important question, and it is a crucial question. I think many South Africans, and indeed people globally, can relate to this feeling of governance fatigue. We've seen a cycle of scandals, both in the public and the private sectors, which has eroded trust. So it's easy to become cynical, right? However, I think there is this belief that this moment of fatigue is also a moment of profound opportunity. It's forcing us to think deeper around the purpose of governance, which is why I penned this. And I think what's important about King 5 and what makes it so significant is really its shift in philosophy. So I think if we look at the previous iterations of the King reports, which were very foundational, we often interpreted most of those requirements and principles in the King reports with a compliance lens. So a checklist that is to be completed. What I find a little bit different about King 5 is the call for fundamental change insofar as it relates to the mindset. It actually moves away from this governance box ticking exercise to a focus on tangible outcomes. Things like, so you hear the wording of ethical culture, societal value creation, and stakeholder inclusivity. So I think what I'm finding here is the explicit focus on the board's duty in the context of economy, society, and the environment. So this isn't just about preventing failure, which is I think a reflection from my side. It's about ensuring that we're actively shaping a better future. So the sense that this is actually a moral leadership issue. It's a proactive one. It's a values-driven one. And it's an approach that we'd like to now see in governance. So, if I have to use a practical example, it's almost as if it's a difference between a driver who obeys the speed limit to avoid a fine, right? And a driver who carefully and genuinely cares for the passengers and the road users around him. The one is about compliance, just want to obey the limits so I don't get a fine. And the second form is almost where now I think we need to focus on when it comes to governance, in the form of moral leadership. So King 5 is actually asking corporate leaders to be that second type of driver, not to just govern out of fear of punishment, but a deep sense of duty to society. So in my view, I think to answer your question more directly, Kamini, this is the moment of moral leadership, because the old one or the old model at least, is broken. Trust is a finite resource that we've seen in South Africa. Our leaders in the public sector and the private sector have depleted it. So King 5 provides a framework, not just a magic bullet, a compass that I think is saying to our leaders, rebuild the trust by anchoring governance to a deeper sense of purpose and responsibility. So this is why we need to move from this opportunity of fatigue to one of renewal and leadership that I think is a journey that boards nowadays need to think very carefully about. So I hope that at least answers the reason for positioning my article like that.
Thanks for that, Ntokozo. We will get deep into that later on in the conversation. But what struck me is that you work in operational risk at one of South Africa's leading financial institutions, yet you would also think deeply about African philosophy and its relevance to technology governance. This is not a typical conversation. How did you come to see Ubuntu as essential to AI governance? What connected the dots for you?
No, I think that's valid. It's a fair observation, and you spot on, and you're right. I think it's not a typical career path. On the surface, the world of operational risk focuses on data, it focuses on controls and processes, and can seem very distant from the world of African philosophy, like you're alluding to now, Kamini. So for a very long time, I saw them as separate parts of life, if you want to, look at it that way. The connection for me really crystallized when I started looking at the risks associated with artificial intelligence and your AI. In operational risk, our job typically is to think about what could go wrong. So with traditional systems, the risks are often technical and they're often process related. But with AI, the risks are fundamentally human. And we're talking about the risk of, an AI bias, for example, algorithmic bias that perpetuates historical injustices, for example, the risk of AI systems making decisions that lack compassion, or the risk of tech or technology creating deeper societal divides, which is quite a scary way to look at it. When I realized that this is actually what I was grappling with, I was grappling with this human-centric risks that we need to manage. So I realized that our traditional risk management frameworks were perhaps inadequate. They were missing a moral language. And that's when I turned to a term that as South Africans we're proud to use, Ubuntu. I remember reading about an AI-powered recruitment tool, for example, that was found to be biased against female candidates. The algorithm had to learn from historical data, right? And in doing so, it learned our own societal biases. So from a purely technical perspective, the AI was working perfectly. But from a human perspective, there was a failure in perpetuating inequality. So that for me is a light bulb moment for how we need to consider how we build this notion of ethical AI, not to just focus on the code. We should actually be focusing on the values we embed in that code. Ubuntu is actually about that notion of how we emphasize on our interconnectedness, our dignity, our shared humanity. And I think from my perspective is a powerful framework for thinking about those values. So for me to connect Ubuntu to AI governance isn't just a pure academic exercise. It's also about a professional necessity. I think it's about expanding the definition of risk to include human and societal impact, insofar as technology is concerned, Kamini. So I think it's about realizing that in the 21st century, you can't just be a responsible leader. In fact, you can't be a responsible leader or a competent risk professional without actually having that practical, way of looking at this from a philosophical level and separating the domains. I think that period of time is now gone. the two are no longer separate domains. And I think that's essentially what I'm trying to bring to the fore in terms of the thought leadership piece around this Ubuntu and its connectedness to AI governance.
Fantastic. Just as an aside, I actually teach ethics in AI, and I teach risk and crisis management. And I always tell my students, ethical culture is a risk mitigation strategy. You must always remember that. And that creating an ethical culture actually substantially mitigates your risk and creates a risk awareness culture. You know, when you have your safe spaces, when you have spaces where conversations can be had in terms of root cause analysis, when you have conversations where someone from the bottom of the organization can go up to the leader and say, I'm not happy about this. This is what I saw. And then you start advancing this culture of excellence towards risk management.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. I think it definitely is a professional necessity, and it definitely is around ensuring that as a human, in most respects, most organizations are human organizations. So they have people working there, and I think the people working in those organizations should absolutely come to the fore in terms of what this means for us, instead of being victims of what the technology itself, forces us to move to.
So, moving on to understanding Ubuntu, for most South Africans, it's obvious. I am because we are. I mean, it's almost in our DNA. So, in conversations about the global South, I've had previous podcast guests. I'm repeatedly told how critical indigenous and value systems are to creating governance that are locally relevant. And now the latest iteration of the code, King 5, Ubuntu is explicitly included as a guiding philosophy. And that makes my heart sing. For our international listeners, can you start by explaining what Ubuntu is?
No, I think it's a wonderful question, Kamini. That the term Ubuntu is becoming well known, like you say, globally. But I think its depth can sometimes be lost in translation. It's much more than a simple feel-good concept, which I often hear, scholars and the population at large, almost like getting a sense that this is just a feel-good concept. It's nice to talk about, but I would just challenge us to think about this, I think, a bit more profoundly, as the concept being profound, both ethically and philosophically. Okay. At its heart, I think Ubuntu is about understanding our own humanity and how that is linked to the humanity of others. And I think you're right, Kamini, that it's almost that is a good starting point. I am because we are. But it goes deeper. It means that my actions, I often say to people, my actions have consequences for you, and your well being is interconnected to my own. So it's a philosophy that emphasizes community, rightly so, compassion and social harmony, rightly so, which is, I think, what we see a lot in the body of knowledge and how we define it. It reminds us that we're just not isolated as individuals, but we're part of a larger human family. I wanted to use system, but I think let me actually make it a little bit personal. A human family, and then I think in the governance context, it calls for a leadership model that is one that is built from empathy and integrity and a commitment for the common good. So what I often like to say, Comedy, when I talk about Ubuntu is just realizing that we can make this practical. So how do we make it practical? I mean, if you think, for example, in a rural community, which is often how you just break down this concept to its bare essentials, right? Think about a rural community that actually has a single water source, okay? Or wow, a purely individualistic mindset might actually lead a person in that community to take as much water as they want. Okay. So whenever you think about Ubuntu and how that may play out in that community, Ubuntu would say that the community needs to manage that well collectively. So ensuring that everybody has enough water, that the well is maintained for future generations. But most importantly, Ubuntu would say that the most vulnerable members of the community are to be cared for. So if one member of the community just takes as much water as they want, that's not Ubuntu in practice. So Ubuntu in practice is a sense of shared ownership and collective responsibility over the resources that we have as a society and as a company. So why does it belong to corporate governance? Because I think that's where most people struggle, and why I find this resonates in the latest King 5. Beg your pardon. I think it's because corporations are like that well or that water source like I've just described. They are powerful. They have shared resources that have an impact on society. So for too long, we've allowed a purely individualistic or profit at all costs mindset to dominate the boardroom. And the results are just plain to see, right? Where that continues, we actually continue to perpetuate a rising inequality. We look at the environment degradation happening all around us, and a breakdown in social trust, which is where we started the conversation, comedy. So I think King 5's inclusion of Ubuntu is, in many sense, can be revolutionary, right? It can be a revolutionary statement. It's saying that business is not just an economic activity in many respects. It's about business or the corporation being a corporate citizen. I know we sometimes use these words lightly and these phrases lightly, but it's about being a corporate citizen. And what does that mean? It means that as a corporate, we should have moral and social responsibility. So it's calling for lack of a better term, a new kind of capitalism, one that's more humane, is where we're being challenged, one that's more inclusive, and ultimately one that's more sustainable. But I think we have to kind of have this narrative live in our boardrooms in such a way that we can talk about it on how, in practice, we actually apply this. So Ubuntu is just arguing for the well-being of the community, and it's not separate from the success of the business. They're actually one of the same thing. So I hope that almost captures how that plays out in real terms, but how as a country we should reflect on this King 5 and how boards should actually think about it when it talks about ethical and effective leadership as a principle one that's still held very dearly by the writers of King.
Thank you for that. While you're talking, I just got back to this whole issue of critical indigenous value systems. So wherever you look at them, whether it's a First Nations people, Aborigine people, Inuit people, you have this concepts of community-based values that are people, planet, and sustainability. And deep inside, I think we always knew this, we just forgot. Or some of us, especially in the West, we forgot about what kept us going all this time. And now it's almost ironic that we are going to the very values that allowed us to become 8 billion people on the planet. And we're going back, and it's new concepts of people, planet, sustainable. These are all concepts. We're just remembering what makes us as one common humanity and in sustainability with the planet. Yes, thanks for that.
I fully agree, and it's important to make that distinction. You spot on. It's almost as if humans have very short memories.
Indeed.
And forget what harms us, and therefore pulling us to the center is how we reflect on these principles to move us forward. But somebody has to call it out, otherwise, I think we can almost lose our way.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely correct in saying that we need a new kind of capitalism, and if that is based on African value systems for our continent, then so be it. Because again, we need homegrown solutions. We need homegrown ways of doing how we operate. We're not sitting in Paris or London.
Correct. Correct. You're preaching to the converted, Kamini. Fully agreed.
So going back to Ubuntu's value proposition, it's fundamentally South African governance code, but much of AI governance globally draws from Western ethical frameworks: autonomy, fairness, accountability. How does Ubuntu offer something different? And what does it center that Western frameworks miss? And I think it ties in exactly to what we were just talking about.
Sure. For sure. I think it's very important to make that distinction, and you have made it so eloquently, Kamini. The principles of autonomy, if you think about it, of fairness, in many respects of accountability, that have emerged from primarily the West, or Western thought, are absolutely essential. I think those are key. They form the bedrock of our efforts when we build, I think, a trustworthy AI, right? And we shouldn't move away from them. I think the question for me is whether these principles are valuable. It's not, so I think my view is, let me just rephrase. I think my view is not whether these principles are valuable, but whether they are complete, which is where I think Ubuntu comes in. What Ubuntu introduces, in my perspective, is a shift that is our starting point. Western frameworks largely are born of, enlightenment, right? Ubuntu for us, that's our starting point. Community is our starting point. So when you look at the Western principles, they place a lot of autonomousness around individuals, and the individual almost at the center of the moral universe. So they ask questions about individual rights, which is right to ask. They ask questions about consent and harm. Ubuntu starts, in my view, at a different place. It starts with the community, and our inherent connectedness is where Ubuntu goes. So it asks a different set of questions. For example, does this action strengthen the fabric of our community, for example, right? Does this practice promote humanity or social harmony and cohesion, is another question that Ubuntu asks. Does this uphold, as an example, the dignity of every person as a member of the collective? It actually centers around our shared humanity and mutual responsibility in a way that these individualistic frameworks that often come from the West do not. So that's how I look at this, Kamini. The traditional Western system, frames this problem with a conflict between the user, and the expression of one's freedom, and then it becomes a balancing act. From my view, an Ubuntu-centric approach should reframe this completely as a problem, in my view. So, if you talk AI, what kind of digital community is AI creating, right? Is it fostering division, or is it encouraging dialogue? Is it encouraging mutual respect? Is it nurturing that? Is it cultivating, individual rights and inclusiveness, for example, in how we build this AI? So ultimately, AI for me shouldn't basically seek to replace principles of fairness and accountability, which some people with the Western framework may think that it's trying to do. So that's where I think the relational dimension needs to just be checked a bit before we embrace those kind of developments in AI. So for me, it's around whether the wisdom of our diverse philosophical traditions keep that in check. So it's including the profound insights of our shared humanity, which I feel Ubuntu offers into the dialogue.
So, what would you tell an AI systems developer from South Africa who comes to tell you, Ntokozo, why are you making more work for me? Why are we reinventing the wheel here? What do you say?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think we're asking the critical question about how we translate a deep human wisdom into the logic of an algorithm, right? So that's what we should say to this developer. It's actually about what does this mean to build an AI that understands it exists not in a vacuum, but in a web of human relationships. That's what we should challenge about them. So, what is the solution that you're bringing to us? So, how we design an AI with Ubuntu principles fundamentally changes its success criteria. So, it's not a conventional AI that's designed to optimize a single or narrow goal for a user, but it's actually how an Ubuntu-inspired AI, I would say, would have a more complex objective as a function. It would seek to basically look at the impact of its actions on the network of relationships around the user. And whether they think about it that way is a different question.
So what you are actually suggesting that we have a whole paradigm shift in the way in which we view technology. So where do we
Absolutely.
start with that? What do we tell our developers? Where do we
Spot
go
on.
to think like that? Or it's simply
Spot
a
on.
case of putting yourself, firstly, starting with individualism and say, as an individual, being part of the collective, how would I want myself and my people to be treated?
I love that. I mean, I love that example. So we need to basically be context aware, which is what you're saying, Comedy. Socially intelligent. So in other words, prioritize the outcomes that strengthen community bonds. That's an example. Uphold the collective well-being rather than just serving an individual's immediate request, right? So I think that's what we need to almost engage with our tech people to start realizing that is the outcome that we want is more of duty of care for communities and one that really prioritizes the collective well-being as opposed to just the individual well-being. So it's really a journey as part of a larger system that we're trying to sort of work with here.
So we're talking about some very heavy ideas here, a new kind of capitalism beyond profitability.
Mm,
King 5 establishing a new moral benchmark in terms of success. It says boards should measure success not only in terms of profit but by societal impact, what is
mm,
called impact materiality. Boards must consider how their decisions shape the world around them.
mm,
So
mm,
Ubuntu encourages leadership grounded in moral imagination and integrity.
mm,
So, how does this shift from profit only to
mm,
impact centered governance? These are big ideas. Change what
mm.
boards must measure and manage from where they came from. And how does Ubuntu provide the philosophical foundation for the shift? How do boards
No, great
actually
question.
measure this? What metrics are meaningful versus performative? I mean, these are big questions boards are going to face.
Mm. That's actually spot on. And you're asking a question. I think for me, the one thing to talk about these ideas in principle, right? We need to talk about these ideas in principle, and the board should actually engage that principle in mind. It's not another to embed them into a medition. It's almost like let's embed them into this machinery of corporate governance. Okay, so
I
so we need
like
to start
that.
with the
I like
principle.
that
We don't
because that's the
we don't.
easy solution. That's what they want. They say, please just tell me and I'll embed it. And it doesn't
Yes,
happen like that because you need to apply your mind.
hold on. It doesn't start like that. You need to apply your mind. And I think the shift from a singular focus of profit to a broader view of impact is what is most significant here. So the most challenging aspect of King 5, and you're right to be wary of these performative metrics, is the danger of impact washing. That is for me very, very, very real. What Ubuntu does, from my perspective, Carmen, is that it provides a moral and a philosophical why behind this impact materiality, which is a concept that's also used in this sort of King 5. So we accept that Ubuntu's premise is that I am because we are, then a corporation cannot be healthy, a thriving entity in a sick or fractured society. I mean, if we accept that Ubuntu is the premise of I am because we are, right? then what the company does and the directors who are, this mind and soul of the company are starting to realize that the company, if that's the case, cannot thrive in a society that's very fractured. So the long-term sustainability of a business is linked to the well-being of the community. It's linked to the environment. It's linked to the employees. So I think for me, the shift from a board perspective is from being a watchdog of financial performance to being a steward of value in its fullest sense. Right? So it means that the board must engage in a new portfolio of assets and liabilities that don't always appear on the balance sheet. And that's essentially their license to operate. The trust of their customers, the health of their workforce or employees, the relationship they have with the natural environment. That's a qualitative, critical thinking mind exercise. It's not just a quantitative view of how this company is going to reach its purpose in the long term.
We started off with talking about governance fatigue. Now we're talking about exploring the philosophical why. Ntokozo, are you asking too much?
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe so. I think what we perhaps need to do is, how do we measure is a key aspect of for me. I think some of the metrics that have been there in the past are not going to take us into the future. So that's why we need to take this from both a philosophical and a practical perspective. So this is why we need to, I think, be humble and innovative at the same time. So there's no single impact number that I think can neatly fit into a reported annual statement. So I think that's why I'm challenging directors and boards and people who are in this terrain to look at. So trying to create one often leads us to performative metrics. So instead of a single, I think, number for me, a meaningful measure, involves around a qualitative combination of both quantitative and qualitative data. So we should engage in that, and we shouldn't be scared to give this qualitative view that we sometimes scared to give. So for me, what's important is having structured, meaningful conversations in the boardroom about what the company's societal role is. How often are those happening in the boards? Certainly the ones that I've observed and participated in, we need to move the needle there. It means that the board should be hearing directly from stakeholders, employees, the community and customers at large. I think that is the most meaningful metric, is the quality of the conversation that happens at the board level. So is the board asking enough tough questions, is what I'm saying, Kamini? Well, are they challenging management to think beyond this next quarter? The goal isn't a perfect dashboard for me. It's more about the consciousness and the responsible decision-making process that we have our governing bodies considering as we make decisions. So I'm not asking too much to answer your question.
So from what I hear from what you're saying, it strikes me that the most important thing here is intentionality. And through that intentionality, you get beyond looking at that compliance tick box and let us get through this in order to make sure X, Y, and Z is done. It's about, we've got a big role here. We've got a big role. We form part of, we are one part of the whole, but all of us working in synergy towards this goal of changing this, the way we do governance, and as you said, new kind of capitalism, new kind of way in which we interpret our ecosystem. That's what we need to do with intentionality.
No, I fully agree. And the impact, I think part of it is exactly that, is understanding the impact of all that on people, on the planet, and obviously that becomes a material factor in the business decision that we then have to make. But it can't be done in isolation, which quite often gets done.
Let's talk about isolation, and let's talk about your work on financial inclusion. I remember when I studied political science many moons ago, South Africa was described as islands of development in seas of undevelopment. And you've described South Africa as existing in two worlds, the formal economy and the informal communities. These are two different realities. And you've argued that AI must learn to see informal economies, understand township resilience, and honor, I like this, and honor the dignity embedded in everyday financial practices. Can you walk us through a concrete example of Ubuntu-centered AI design in financial services? What would actually change?
Sure. I think thanks for bringing that up. I mean, I'm penning these things, and now I'm being asked to reflect, on it again. I think that's excellent. It's an issue that I'm passionate about. I think for decades, the formal financial sector has been largely blind to the vibrant economic activity that happens in informal communities. So our systems are built on formal data. Like you said, in the article, I said pay slips, credit scores. That addresses formal stuff. If you don't have those, you are invincible. Okay, so AI, if we're not careful, will deepen that blindness because it learns from the same biased data, right? So I think for me, an AI-centered AI, on Ubuntu rather, centered AI in financial services would be designed with the explicit goal of seeing the unseen. So instead of just asking for a formal credit score, I think in my view, one would need to design to understand that rich data of informal economies also exists. This means that we need to look at what I was saying in the article, a stock file, the rotating savings and credit associations and payment histories and long-term relationships with local suppliers, right, of that stock file or that small business, even if it's not formally banked. That's a fundamental change from how the system currently works. So, do you fit our own model? Is where we are now, or are we looking for what is unique in the financial story of what exists in our economy now and how we can support it? So it's about designing in many respects for dignity, right? And I think you asked for, this is a practical example. So let's look at a woman who runs a successful food stall or spice shop in a township, right? She has steady income, believe it or not. They are loyal customers, and she has a strong reputation in her community. But she has no formal credit history. Before, if she applies for a small loan to buy a new stove, the bank's algorithm sees only missing data and rejects that business loan instantly, right? So the system is actually blind to her credit worthiness in inverted commas. But after you look at sort of an Ubuntu-centered AI, the process becomes very different, right? The AI is designed to accept alternative data. The loan that she's looking for, when we assess it, we use a mobile app to capture her cash flow records, right? We record who, as an example, testimonials from her suppliers, or we verify her good standing in her local stock file. Then we use this AI that is very relational to assess her risk. We recognize her community standing as a formal form of collateral. So it sees her not just as a risk, but as a resilient entrepreneur and small business person in that community. She gets the loan, she grows her business, and the bank gains a loyal customer. So for me, the AI has been taught to see her humanity and not just her as data. I hope that example explains just how I'm thinking about this comedy. So it's just a means of how we operationalize Ubuntu in AI. So it's not just about being nice; it's about building smarter and more inclusive, effective systems for me as we grow the economy and as we move forward with this powerful tool.
It's just a bit absurd to me that, there's 50 billion rand circulating in stock files, And that's just one aspect of the informal economy. But because our way of thinking, they are the unseen. Imagine if we could capture that market and say, but as you said, as you mentioned before, you know what? There's a trust deficit, and that's something that needs to be worked on, but it's a start.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I agree. And I think it's more, it's ultimately using this tech. It, our aim is not to perpetuate, the same old narrative. It's actually about dismantling old barriers, not to reinforce them. So for me, it's actually a question of how the AI learns to see dignity and resilience in informal economies. Right? It becomes a powerful tool for shared prosperity, like we mentioned a little bit earlier. So it's about building, in my view, a financial system that serves everybody, not just the formerly employed. That is the power of this particular technology to transform what we have in front of us, which currently it's not seeing, or at least we're not coding it to see. So there then lies in the potential.
It's just like an affirmation of somebody. I see you. I see
Hmm.
you and you matter.
Love that.
But you're talking about Ubuntu. I understand Ubuntu. I live Ubuntu, and it's a beautiful philosophy.
Mm.
I'm sitting in, most probably not too far from you. I'm sitting in Santon, and I'm less than 5 k's away from Alex. So it's a beautiful philosophy, but when material inequality, as it is so stark in South Africa, does it risk being aspirational? I mean,
Mm.
I always say to people, you know what, when you are doing your code of conduct, when you are doing your values, ethics is aspirational. So does it risk being aspirational rather than actionable? And how do you respond to that critique?
No, you know what? I think you've made something very clear, and I think I must also be very clear on this comment, and it's completely a valid critique. The reality of South Africa's inequality is brutal. Eh? I mean, let's say that off the bat. We do live in two different worlds, right? And you're right, there is a real danger that a beautiful philosophy like Ubuntu can be used as, to paper, rather to paper over these difficult, deep structural divides that we have as a society. So therefore, it can become a bit hollow, aspirational, rather than a catalytic for change. I'm very conscious of that. And I believe we must confront that danger head on. The power of Ubuntu is not that it makes us feel good, like we started off. It's one that makes us responsible. So it tells us that the formal and the informal economies are not two separate worlds, which is how we sometimes treat it as society and where we live, common in where we're based. We can almost see it as two separate worlds. There are two parts of one deeply wounded society, and the health of one is ultimately dependent on the health of another. And I think that's what you're alluding to, is that we sit in Sandton, but right opposite us is Alexandra. So for the board applying an Ubuntu principle, this means that you must reject the idea that the informal world is someone else's problem, which is often what's happened. It means that recognizing that the poverty of us that we see in our doorstep right next door us is as a direct threat to the long-term sustainability of our business and how we operate. So we must start having those charged with governance seeing that our business practices, whether it's hiring, whether it's pricing, whether it's supply chains, whether AI systems like we're talking about now, either widen or narrow this gap. So it makes the inequality of a material risk to the business not just a societal issue, right? We just actually need to realize that is that we need to realize that this equality is not something that's very far away from us. It's right next to us, and I think that's where I want to almost pause, comment. You say you spot on. We need to look at this a lot critically from a 360-degree perspective, not just from our world. And then that rises the debate a little bit more in terms of how we overcome it as a collective. So it's not just a merely aspirational view, I would argue. It's really about moving us forward. The individualistic view is very much a Western concept.
When you spoke about that sustainability, I was just and fragmentation, I just recall, I mean, apartheid. I mean, I lived through apartheid, and to think that the thought at the time was that was sustainable. We only as strong as our weakest link in any society. Whether we're going to call it apartheid or whether we're going to call it wealth inequality, we have to know that we can only be sustainable and we can be prosperous and we can move forward, all of us. I'm not suggesting redistribution of wealth or something, but I'm saying we have to make sure the weakest of us are placed in the strongest position that they can be.
Spot on. And I mean, you spot on. I think for me, this concept that we're talking about now is not just an aspirational choice. It's actually a pragmatic one. So it is the only philosophy that offers a path towards a more shared and sustainable future. So in the end, for me, the most actionable survival strategy we have is this Ubuntu that we're entertaining now.
Indeed. So going from compliance to leadership, your article mentions governance fatigue and the risk that boards view compliance as a checkbox rather than a leadership opportunity. So many executives, as we know, treat governance as a compliance obligation, not as an opportunity for leadership. From my experience, many executives treat ethics, organizational ethics, also as management of fraud and corruption, which is obviously not. It's an aspirational philosophy. So we talked about what's driving this compliance fatigue. So from your perspective, how can King 5 and Ubuntu help boards move from compliance thinking? Because this is hard. To be brave is hard. From compliance thinking to genuine moral courage and ethical responsibility in practice.
Now, I think it's a super question. And I think the idea that this philosophy is now supercharged, through our King 5 is what excites me. I mean, it frames governance not as a shield, but as, if you were, as a steering wheel, right? So it's not just about what you must avoid, which I think is what we're challenging our boards to do. It's about what you must do and where you must go. So Ubuntu provides, that perspective and that destination, a more just, a more stable, a more prosperous society, right? So it actually gives governance a moral purpose. For me, it says to a board member, if I have to be explicit, your job is not just about protecting this company from risk. Okay. Your job is to lead this company in a way that contributes to the well-being of society. I mean, if you're a board member that is not there yet, I think we need to rethink your role. So it's about profoundly more inspiring and a more energizing mandate, not just about managing risk. It is really about the contribution that we can make to the well-being of society. I mean, I find that very, very inspiring. So for me, it needs to be the difference between moving, if we have to talk practically commonly, moving a security guard and somebody who basically says, my job is to patrol the perimeter, right? And make sure that nothing bad happens. Yes, we appreciate that. That's a necessary job. But it's defensive and reactive, right? I mean, for us, that's just compliance. But what's beautiful is that if you can help that person envision sort of a much more beautiful, functional way that they can contribute to their current world or current job. It's actually about what you talked about earlier. It's about having a form of courage community that says that what I'm doing here is far more about building something more worthwhile, not just about guarding this fortress. You know what I mean? So how do we take our mind there? It's not just about my job here. It's more about how collectively we contribute to how society looks like, or how we contribute to how we want society to look like, is what I'm essentially challenging. So we're moving from compliance. I don't think we're there anymore. It's about challenging human leadership, and that leadership, unlike compliance, is something that requires of us to generally be courageous and be committed to society as a whole, not just about the companies that we represent.
So I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you were faced with a risk and sustainability committee or a board subcommittee, audit committee, plain words, plain language, what would you tell them? How do you go about this? Be brave.
I think the key thing. No, you spot on. I think the key thing for me is being able to understand that these committees are there to foster discussion. Part of the quantitative information is just to inform the discussion. Really, it's an outcome of what takes place in those conversations that moves us forward. So I would encourage risk managers to get away from just producing meaningful metrics and data and information that doesn't inform a qualitative discussion around what is it that we want to decide on. Okay. So when you talk about the board, when you talk about an audit and risk committee, the ultimate decision of an audit and risk committee is to say, look, is what we're seeing really really what is happening in the environment? A good director would ask that. A good committee member would ask that. Is what you're saying to me that we are asked to look at here really what is happening in the environment, and what decision do you want me to make from that? Practically, that's how you would do it. Otherwise, just taking what's on that paper or deck at face value.
Absolutely, and sometimes it's just a bit of reflection as well. Is to say that let's start with the end in mind. I mean, if we got this down pat, what would it look like? Okay, all right, so this is what we aspire to, but what is our reality, and where is that gap, and how can we bridge that gap and say these are actionable, implementable, and quantifiable ways of actually getting to a point where we want to go. So you work in investment banking, where efficiency and profitability pressures are intense.
Yeah.
So you are talking to somebody in the investment banking environment, and how do you make the business case for Ubuntu-centered AI governance? Is this a trade-off, or can Ubuntu and business performance align? That's what people are asking. That's what the conversation is about.
Sure.
It's like, because to many people sitting in this boardroom, it's an airy-fairy conversation. What do you mean governance in terms of I am because we are? What does this mean? Don't talk to me about quantifiable metrics and Ubuntu. What do you say about that?
No, it's an excellent question. So the case for Ubuntu-centered AI governance rests on a broader and a longer-term understanding of value and risk. So the whole model of business that externalizes social, that externalizes environmental costs, is becoming increasingly risky and unsustainable. So I mean, let's start there. So it's actually what we externalized previously is no longer appropriate. So in a world of radical transparency about the company's reputation, its social license to operate, for example, and the trust of its customers are the most valuable assets, I believe, that we need to consider today. So an Ubuntu-centered approach is fundamentally about protecting and enhancing those assets, in my view. It's about recognizing that a business that acts unethically, that deepens societal division, or that harms its community is building its foundation on unsustainable ground. So it may be profitable today, don't get me wrong, but it is fragile tomorrow at best, right? So, I mean, you just have to look at the major corporate scandals that we've had over the past 2 decades. In most And if, in most cases, you see a company that's prioritized short-term profit at the expense of its values. That's what we're seeing, essentially. That you may have hit your quarterly targets, but the long-term result is actually very catastrophic, in the form of fines, in the form of the loss of customers, in the form of brand reputation, and ultimately the collapse of shareholder value. So I'm positing that an Ubuntu-centered AI approach is actually a very powerful risk management tool in most respects, because it's forcing us to consider our impact on all stakeholders. It helps us to see, for lack of a better word, the iceberg before we hit them. So I think it's the most effective way to ensure that the company will still be here and still be respected in 10, 20, or 50 years' time. So there is something that we need to look at here, and it is actually practical. It's not just philosophical.
So, as head of operational risk, how does Ubuntu change how you think about AI risk? And does it surface different risks than conventional frameworks? And does it require different controls? And it just occurred to me now, talking about our South African context. If you have, for example, credit risk modeling, and you're training data where it says that single mothers, particularly black women, are bad creditors, how are you going to mitigate that? Or how are you going to look at it differently?
Yes. No, very, very good. I think you asked around, how does it surface different risks? I think in terms of, rather than conventional frameworks. Look, I think for me, it changes it profoundly. My training and the conventional frameworks for operational risk are very good at identifying, all sorts of risk. Like we said in the beginning around, process failures, system outages, misstatements, frauds, etc. All of these are important, but they no longer just, should be viewed in isolation. The risks posed for me by AI are actually quite different in nature, and they require a different lens, which is what we've been saying. Carmini, I think for me, the key thing is what I call relational risks. These risks actually are ensuring that, particularly our AI systems, right? If we're not careful, they will damage relationships of trust that we have with our customers. If we're not careful, they may even impact our employees and the communities that we serve. So a conventional framework might ask, in my view, that does the algorithm work correctly? Which is right from a conventional framework perspective, in my view. An AI, call it inspired framework, will ask, does the AI treat people with dignity? That's a good question. Does it promote fairness? Does it erode or does it build, social cohesion? So it actually surfaces the risks that, AI bias may have if we don't ask these questions. So the risk of creating echo chambers for me, at the risk of dehumanizing customer service, is something that we need to basically look out for. So let's say we are developing an AI-powered chatbot, for example, and we ask it to handle customer queries. A conventional risk assessment would focus on things like, is this chatbot secure? Is this giving us accurate information? Is it available 24/7? And we've seen that. That's what it would ask, right, from a conventional perspective. But one with an Ubuntu lens would probably ask, I think, force us at least to ask questions that are a bit different. What happens when a vulnerable elderly customer gets stuck in a loop within a chatbot and can't get to us as a human? Can't get to speaking to a human. Are we just risking a customer complaint? No, we're risking their dignity. We are not considering that demographic. we're not just risking bad PR. We are risking the trust of that particular customer or community. So these relational risks for me are far more damaging than in the long run than a system outage, if I have to think about it, to be honest.
You know, that's so many interesting issues that you raise, and immediately I thought about an aspect that I teach in ethics of AI, which is Western epistemic models and bias in training data. And we're talking about social cohesion. And if you took the training data, for example, from the US, people like you, black males of a certain age group, would absolutely be not in favor or not contributing to our social cohesion. So,
Exactly.
so we have
This
to be
shows the
so careful
perception
when
of
we
the
talk
bias.
about these things in terms of where is the training data from? What is the bias, particular bias there? You know, and is this basically is the AI system that trained on particular data, is it relevant for our particular context?
Yeah, yeah.
And
I
that's
love that
hard
example.
stuff. That's hard stuff because we take all of that, oh no, it's AI, it must be correct. No.
No. So I agree with you. It means that when we talk using training example, it means that training our staff to be moral first responders who can spot and escalate these relational risks, right? Ultimately, that's the most important control for me. There's a culture of responsibility where everybody in the organization feels a sense of ownership for the human impact of the technology that they're building. That is, in essence, managing risk through the Ubuntu lens, Kwame.
So, you know, organizations are going to sit with operationalizing the principles of King 5 on the 1st of January. What is what insight do you have and what do you wish them from all of your experience? What do you want them to know?
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think if there's one insight I wish boards understood is that King 5 is not about just stakeholder management, right? It's actually about stakeholder service. The language of management is still rooted in a mindset of control, eh? And I think we need to be just careful how we view that. When we manage risks, we manage assets, but you cannot manage human beings and their trust just by being reckless when you look at this notion. So trust is something that you earn through service, right? Just think about the products and services that we consume in commonly. So the moment a board shifts into the form of mindset that do we manage our stakeholders' expectations, I think it's almost the right question, the wrong question, or maybe a limited question. But it's actually how do we manage our stakeholder expectations to how do we serve our stakeholders' legitimate needs, right? So it's not just around that stakeholder management. It's just about how do we serve our stakeholders' legitimate needs. Is something that I would want us to reflect on. So there's a subtle but profound shift in posture, right? One is moving from power, a position of power, to humility, right? Uh, and the other component is that it starts moving from an extraction type notion, management and control, as an instrument, like being an instrument to actually one of contribution. It's not just about us extracting, but it's how we're contributing. So I think
I
that's how
love
I'd
that.
like to look
I
at
just
it.
have to say,
Yeah.
I love that. I love that
Mm,
that shift you're saying from
mm,
exploitative, extractive to saying
mm,
one of sustainability, partnership,
mm.
and dare I say it, mutual benefit.
Absolutely, absolutely. So absolutely, it's about. I mean, it's subtle, but it's such profound because I think you could almost miss it in terms of how subtle it is in posture. And we should start thinking about it that way. And I think a company might engage with the local community, about a factory that they might want to put up. The stakeholder management approach is to hold a town hall, present the plan, handle objections, for example, offer some concessions to get the project approved. The goal essentially there, in many respects, I think, is just to manage dissension. Right? But the stakeholder, I think, what we're talking about just now, the stakeholder service approach starts much earlier, if you want to use a practical example. So it begins by asking the community, what do you need as a community? What are your hopes and fears? And how can this project, if it goes ahead, be a genuine asset to this community? So it pretty much involves a co-creation than just a consultation. So that the goal is not actually to get your way, but is to find a shared way forward, if that makes sense.
You're sounding less and less like a banker. I'm worried about you.
Look, you learn through experience, and it's like you learn through upholding certain values. I think the posture of service for me is the very essence of Ubuntu, which what we've been talking about for the past hour. It's about I am because we are. So I think from a board perspective, if we truly understand that our primary role is to serve society and not just shareholders, then the principles of King 5 cease to be a burden and then become this, moral leadership and guide that we can start really use as a compass.
So let's move on to global South perspectives. Most AI development happens in Silicon Valley, London, Beijing, not Johannesburg or Lagos. How do we ensure Ubuntu and other global South philosophies meaningfully shape global AI governance rather than just becoming token add-ons? And are Western frameworks for AI trust even appropriate in our context? Do we need fundamentally different approaches?
Look, I think the current geography of AI development creates a huge power imbalance. Like you're saying, the values, assumptions, and even priorities of Silicon Valley and other tech hubs that are being encoded into these digital infrastructure of our future, often without the question, the risk of Ubuntu and indigenous knowledge systems, like you started commonly at the beginning. Are these systems being treated as exotic or token add-ons? Is not just real, it's actually one that is becoming a default to me, So I think what we need to do to avoid, this kind of issue is we need almost a two-part strategy. And the one is we must move from customers just being maybe not, let me talk as a human for a bit. I think we need to move from just being consumers, right, of AI to being producers and shapers of it, is how we can overcome this. In South Africa, what it really means is that we need to invest, in my view, in local tech ecosystems. We have to try and maybe nurture African AI talent and creating our own platforms and solutions that are tailored for our own context. So a friend of mine at MTN, that's where we are in terms of how we look at the subject. We can't, shape the game if we are not on the field. It's almost like what we're trying to say. So, and the second of it, I think, just to look at this is how do we stop thinking about our philosophies as merely local or alternative? So Ubuntu for us is not just about South African value. It's actually a universal human value that we should actually start positioning out there in the global north. It emphasizes on community, dignity, shared humanity, and over this whole hyper-individualistic, market-driven ethos. I think that's what we're trying to do as South Africans, and what we need to position out there, in the global north and other countries that we operate with.
Of course, it makes sense to me, but what makes me cringe is the notion that it becomes tokenized and it becomes like an exotic system, and
Yeah.
and that sort of like just reminds me of colonialism and
Mm.
how you present certain local solutions, and that idea is just distasteful to me. But I suppose it's an approach
Yeah.
of how you do it.
Yeah. No, it's true. But I mean, you also asked something that's very interesting: is are Western frameworks appropriate? I think they are part of the puzzle, but they're not the whole picture. And I think that's what we're saying here is we just need to look at the way we look at AI and its governance purely from a single global approach to one that's I think quite pluralistic in terms of its ecosystem of ideas, where different cultural and philosophical traditions can learn from each other. So for me, the answer to the question, Carmen, is not that we should ignore what's happening in the global north. I think the key thing for me is the goal is not to replace Western frameworks, but to enrich them and where necessary to challenge them. So the future of AI for me, and at least the ethical side of AI, is not just a monologue that's delivered in Silicon Valley or California, for that matter. So it's actually about a global dialogue that I think we need to embark on, and the voices of the global South with philosophers like Ubuntu must be at the heart of the conversation in terms of how we move forward. It can't just be a one-sided debate.
In terms of solutioning, I hear this again and again and again, whether it's from Thailand or from Australia or, or Kenya, for that example. It's about when you're looking at AI governance, when you're looking at AI ethics, or even governance frameworks in whatever region you are as a multinational, it's about co creation with the indigenous knowledge systems, but also it's about tailor making your solutions for the environment. And co-creation is the only method that in my perception, uh, works for creating those solutions that are actually sustainable and efficient for that particular environment.
No, spot on. And I think that is essentially that is profound. It's profound and goes to the very heart of AI and what it is and what it does, right? So it is really about a knowledge technology. It is that. So the question of what in the academic world, what epistemologies, which systems of knowledge it is built on, is absolutely fundamental. For me, the risk of AI infrastructure being built that just recognizes one way of knowing, which is what we were talking about earlier, from an epistemological perspective, is already problematic. So I think there's not one way of knowing, and which is often quite at the heart of how we look at Western scientific data-driven models. We can actually lose a vast wealth of human wisdom. Like you were saying, African epistemologies, for example, often are very relational over purely empirical data. So there is the value of, as an African child, there is the value of the wisdom of the elders, the lived experience of the community, and the understanding of what comes from participation and not just observation.
So I'm going to ask you a very uncomfortable question now. What are you still figuring out? So, given your experience, what questions are you still exploring about embedding Ubuntu into corporate governance?
Sure. We personally, so go ahead, comments. I interrupted you there.
No. I was just furthering that question about what assumptions have you had to let go of?
Yes. Look, I think this whole exercise for me is we have to at least acknowledge that there is a profound sense of intellectual humility that we have to acknowledge when we talk about this. We're still figuring that out in terms of we don't know everything about this topic, whether it's from a governance perspective, whether it's from a risk management perspective, whether it's from a technology perspective. We just do not know everything that is to know. And I think that for me is quite important for leaders to know, right? Is we're still navigating this. We need to be more effective in terms of how we govern this. It's only when those concessions are made, I think we'll get to the right culture in terms of how we look at sort of all these challenges that we're facing. But it's very much around moving just from a pure data perspective, which I often find can be quite problematic and is a weakness in the human system, right? Is we just look at data and then we just opine on data. I get that one must recognize that the spreadsheet and data must be reviewed, but it's only one part of the story, right? For me, what we need to realize is that what we're dealing with now in 2025 is very much a human experience that we need to be sensitive on. So it's about what our employees tell us. It's about what our customers tell us. It's about what our communities tell us. And so an Ubuntu guided report for me would ask at least a bit more than what a market research would ask company. It would ask, what are our customers telling us? What are they really telling us? What are our employees really feeling? Do we actually understand that in the context of us governing better? And the stories that are being told, in fact, are what will move us forward in terms of this topic. That's what we're grappling with. That balance that we need to look at from purely being data-driven, but also being human-driven.
Human-driven. I like that.
Mm.
Let's look at how to start off with all of those things or some of the initiatives. How should universities and business schools prepare future leaders to carry Ubuntu principles into boardrooms and organizational culture? We're not going to default to the position that everybody understands this, and we're going to say, let's formally learn about this. Let's start developing systems where we can use this and we can actually see evidence that this is Ubuntu in action. So how should universities and business schools go about this?
No, look, I think you're touching on another passion of mine. So how should we, as universities and business schools, prepare leaders? I think to prepare leaders to even carry these principles like we've been talking about, we probably need to think about a couple of things. And for me, one of them is to stop treating ethics as a single standalone course, Harmony. Quite often one that actually you take in your final year, which is what I've seen in most academic programs. So stop treating ethics as a single standalone course. I think we need to challenge us there. We need to start looking at how we embed ethics and philosophy into every single course that people take. Leaders, how leaders actually think about this in every single course. So a finance class, in my view, should not just think about maximizing shareholder value, right? It should think about the purpose of capital and the ethics of investment. That's one way. In a marketing class, you just not just end at consumer behavior. It should also talk about the ethics of persuasion. So I think we have to learn that you can't learn empathy or moral courage, in my view, from a textbook. It does need some form of experiential learning and community engagement. So the more opportunities for students to grapple with real world ethical dilemmas, for me, is important. Like we were saying, this is a human context perspective. It's about a living organism in companies. So we need to sort of move the needle there, and I concede that we need to do a lot of work, comedy with us being in the education space, in terms of how we get every student to spend more time, working through real case studies that could potentially help us, move the needle in terms of how we dialogue around this thing. It's not just about reading the next Harvard Business Review article.
Talking about education, I think there's I don't get me started, because there's so many aspects of our education system we need to change. When I see, I'm not sure whether it's Sweden or Denmark, they teach empathy classes. And I want to cry, because that's exactly what we need to shape our society and our young people. We don't start off as a violent, crime-ridden society. We need to start shaping young minds, and it starts with things like, what does empathy mean?
I love that. I actually love that. So imagine. Let's just think about for a minute. Imagine a business school where every student, right, is required to spend a semester big portion of time working with a small business in an informal sector or with a non-profit.
Oh man,
that would not be there. So just think about that. There would be no need for consultants to solve a problem if we were there, because this student will be there to listen, like you were saying, Carmini. That student will be there to learn, and fundamentally, that student will be there to serve. So they would need to learn about resilience. They would need to learn about community. They would need to learn about the realities of poverty in a way that a Harvard Business Review article could never teach them, right? So I think there it comes, to the classroom, a sense of profound humility and a deeper understanding of where society and business is meant to serve than just what we know.
That's such an excellent idea, because I can imagine that student 5 years later being a manager or being head of credit risk, or 10 years later and saying, and somebody says, but that's such a bad credit risk because of X, Y, and Z. You don't understand the dynamics. I've been there. I've seen what happens. This is the story. And that is so judgmental of you, And to have somebody with that level of insight into what's happening in the grounds, that will be profound and transformative, in my opinion.
No, but you're spot on. The leaders of the 21st century will need to be just more than brilliant analysts. They need to, I think, be wise and compassionate as human beings. Because whatever we've had in the past, we've now acknowledged that it's not always working. So they will need to understand that the purpose of business is not just about profit. I know you're criticizing me as a banker, but I think it's not just about.
I'm not. I love bankers.
So, but I have to acknowledge that the past is not necessarily where we should be going. It's not just about creating profit. It's about creating, I think, a prosperous and a just society for all of us. So you talk about education. Our business schools, in my view, have a moral obligation to prepare leaders, to be profoundly responsible. It's not just about, making their own business a success in isolation.
And we have to look at the bigger picture as well. And it's the future is the global south. And Africa is rising. And 1 in 4, 1 in 5 of us by 2030 are going to be African.
Yes.
And I can see you definitely positioning you and your bank towards the future.
Absolutely. No, we start with purpose, not with policy.
And we're talking about hope here. We're talking about the future here. And there were several posts after the recent G20 event in South Africa, including reflections by Dr. Nick Erber about the success of the event and the idea that our secret sauce here in South Africa is our culture and our people. And I felt that familiar surge of pride, despite the slings and arrows I feel that South Africa keeps rising. Am I an irrational optimist? And are we at the cusp of an inflection point in governance in this country?
Well, let me first answer. I know the feeling of being an irrational optimist. Wow. I think many of us are committed to South Africa, and feel that, it is a choice to believe in its potential. And we love this country. And despite its daily evidence of our challenges, I don't think it's being irrational. I think it's an act of will. It's an act of faith in the resilience of our people. So you're not being irrational, Connie. I think for me, what concerns me the most is thinking. Perhaps let me just rephrase it. I think what concerns me the most is the unthinking adoption of issues like AI. The risk is that we will adopt and import AI systems from different contexts, right? Different values, and deploy them without considering South Africa's reality. Essentially, that's what we're saying. My biggest fear is that AI deepens the divides, like I've written, of two worlds, the informal and the formal, treats vulnerable citizens without dignity. And I think that's a problem. The path, and I think in many respects, that's the path of least resistance, least resistance, but it's actually fundamentally a dangerous one. So I don't think we're being, irrational here. I think what gives me hope, though, is the fact that I think South Africans are starting to call out a lot of things that they don't like seeing as our society, as you would have seen as evidence to the many commissions of inquiry that we're having. We're starting to say, but that's not what the people that we want to be. That's not how we want to be led. So I think that gives me hope that we're having the right conversation, and that should give the board hope of a corporation that we're having the right conversation. But likewise, these issues are squarely in the terrain of the boardroom table, right? So I think we must say that how we see this thing turning up in a corporate is that if we take, again, technology, I hope to see in a fintech startup that us using AI would create new models of credit scoring for the unbanked. If you're in health tech, how are you using AI to deliver to rural communities? And I hope universities are also starting the conversation about ethics and technology, which is where we come in. Let's help them about how do we become more moral? How do we understand cultural developments? And is there evidence of us not just being passive consumers of technology, but how are we actively shaping it in our own image? So we pretty much at an inflection point. And I think that inflection point is not a guarantee of success, definitely not. But it is a moment of choice. We need to start deciding what we'd like to see. So we have a choice between, a future that deepens, AI historical wounds, or a future that can actually help heal in divisions of the past in South Africa. So we shouldn't be complacent, and I don't think we are in a position of where we can just sleep on this. There is something that we can do going forward, and how we participate is required from the onset, not when things are happening already.
One last question before we come to our end. What are you reading right now?
What am I reading right now? I will tell you what I'm reading right now. I have started reading a book that I sent to my team, and I hope they take it seriously over the holidays. I love the notion of exponential thinking, right?
Me too.
Yeah, I absolutely love the notion of exponential thinking. So I've encouraged my team, and this is my bedtime reading now, to read a book called Exponential Organizations. Right? I think that's very, very important because they're quite a lot. So Exponential Organizations by Salem Ismail is a book that I'm reading currently, and I'm going to dig into that over the next sort of couple of weeks and in my holiday season. So I think that is something that excites me because it's dynamic. It's dynamic in terms of this information world that we live in now, and it engages with how we as people can think exponentially. So imagine Carmini and Ntokozo, being able to move just beyond where they are in today, but to be able to multiply who they are tomorrow. It's quite a frightening thought, but we actually are able to do that because of the information generation that we're living in now. Yeah.
I know. I think I read about this or I heard about the concept that billion-dollar organizations will consist of
Yes.
one person. Is it the same
Yes.
concept?
Absolutely. Yes. So I absolutely love that, because if you think about it, information accelerates everything, Comedy. I mean, so as industries digitize, for example, hyper growth then follows, right? So we've got an opportunity, if we are able to think exponentially today, to be able to now move into this, I think, disruption of the current norm in the way we look at solving for problems, right? So I'm looking forward to a potential economy in South Africa where it's not so much around large corporates, but how our people who are in small business are able to think exponentially, really to solve our current issues of unemployment and what we have. Because there's so much information available. So if you are an exponential thinker, you should be able to back yourself in terms of being able to build a company and live in a society where you are not a victim, but somebody who's actually has information that they can turn into power. Yeah.
I'd love to talk to you for another 2 hours on exactly that subject, but Ntokozo, thanks so much for your insights. Your perspectives on Ubuntu, King 5, and ethical governance is exactly what boards and executive and practitioners need to know right now. And you remind us that governance should move beyond compliance towards values, impact, and purpose. And most profoundly for me, that profit without responsibility is fragile, and leadership without humanity is hollow. And that strikes me as the heart of the matter. And so thank you for joining us, and I hope that we can look forward to your insights on this show in the future.
It's an absolute privilege, Carmen. I think, I'd love to continue this discussion, and we definitely will look at how we can continue this discussion. And I think for me, the future of AI in Africa is not yet written. So we have a brief, precious window of opportunity to shape it in a way that reflects our values and serves our people. So I'm really looking forward to co-creating that with you and everybody else.
And as the saying is, may you live in interesting times, and that we are. Thank you, Ntokozo. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Carmini.